In the pre-dawn gloom of October 24, 1944, at precisely 7:30 hours, Technical Sergeant Charles Coolidge pressed himself against the sodden earth of the Vosges forest, positioned east of Belmont-sur-Buton, his eyes scanning the dripping pine boughs that concealed an indeterminate force of German infantry somewhere in the murk ahead. 23 years of life. 14 unbroken months of carnage. Salerno's blood-soaked beaches, Anzio's killing ground, the meat grinder of San Pietro, the catastrophic Rapido River crossing, the hell of Monte Cassino, and finally Rome's liberation. The 36th Infantry Division had painted its path across the Italian peninsula in American blood. The Rapido River crossing of January 1944 stood as a monument to military catastrophe. The division had been ordered to force a passage against fortified German defensive works. Within 48 hours of brutal combat, nearly 2,000 American soldiers had been erased, killed outright, maimed beyond recognition, or vanished into German prisoner cages. Entire rifle companies had been obliterated, their names existing only on casualty lists and in the nightmares of survivors. The disaster triggered congressional inquiries. Generals hurled accusations across hearing rooms. Strategic decisions were dissected by men who had never heard bullets snap past their heads. Coolidge had endured every moment of it. Now France claimed him. The 36th had stormed ashore in southern France during August, driving northward through the Rhône Valley toward the German frontier. By late October's arrival, they had penetrated the Vosges Mountains, a landscape of suffocating forest density, precipitous ridges, freezing precipitation, and German defenders who had transformed every elevation into a fortress of interlocking fire. Coolidge commanded a heavy machine gun section. Water-cooled .30 caliber Brownings, weapons capable of disintegrating an infantry charge if properly aim-placed and expertly directed. He had been temporarily assigned to Company K with explicit orders: secure the right flank of 3rd Battalion's advance near Hill 623. The mission parameters presented no difficulty. The personnel situation was catastrophic. Of the 12 soldiers under his direct authority that morning, the overwhelming majority were replacements who had arrived within the preceding 14 days. They had completed their basic training cycles. They had crossed the Atlantic aboard crowded transport vessels. They had been processed through replacement depots and assigned to fill the gaps torn in the division's ranks during the advance through France. They had never experienced combat. Not 1 second of it. No commissioned officer occupied that hilltop. No lieutenant to provide tactical guidance. No captain to assume ultimate responsibility. The highest-ranking American soldier on Hill 623 was Technical Sergeant Charles Coolidge, a man whose hometown was Signal Mountain, Tennessee. A man who had operated machinery in his family's printing establishment before the war consumed his generation. A man who had been conscripted in June 1942 and had deliberately avoided promotion beyond his current rank. The Vosges campaign was exsanguinating the American army. Throughout the weeks preceding October 24, rifle companies across the 36th Division had been reduced to half their authorized strength or worse. A company that should have mustered 180 riflemen might field 70 combat-effective soldiers. Platoons authorized for 40 men were conducting operations with 15 exhausted survivors. The Army funneled replacements into the battle line as rapidly as transport shipping could deliver them from stateside training bases. Most of these young men lasted mere days before joining the casualty statistics themselves. The casualty rates followed patterns that were anything but random. The German defenders possessed intimate knowledge of this mountainous terrain. They had fortified every ridge with overlapping fields of fire. Machine gun positions commanded every conceivable approach route. Mortar teams had pre-registered coordinates for every clearing where American infantry might mass for an assault. American units that advanced without proper reconnaissance invariably stumbled into predetermined kill zones where German gunners simply pulled triggers and watched men fall. Coolidge understood these realities with the clarity that only survival provides. He had been awarded the Silver Star for actions under fire during the Italian campaign. He had witnessed firsthand what German machine guns could accomplish against soldiers caught exposed in open terrain. He knew that inexperienced troops committed fatal errors born of ignorance and panic. He knew that mistakes measured in seconds determined who lived and who died. That morning, Coolidge requisitioned a sergeant from Company K and moved forward to conduct reconnaissance. They needed to identify suitable positions for the heavy guns. They needed fields of fire that would integrate seamlessly with the rifle platoon's defensive sectors. They needed to survey the terrain before committing his untested men to fighting positions they might have to defend with their lives. What they discovered exceeded their worst projections. Moving cautiously through fog and relentless rain, Coolidge and the Company K sergeant blundered directly into German defensive positions. Not a patrol. Not a listening post established for early warning. An entire German infantry company, approximately 150 soldiers entrenched in prepared fighting positions with meticulously planned overlapping fields of fire. The Germans identified them instantaneously. Coolidge possessed perhaps 2 seconds to formulate a response. He could flee, gambling that the Germans would miss or hesitate. He could surrender, hoping for treatment consistent with Geneva Convention protocols. Or he could attempt something that existed in no army field manual ever published, no tactical doctrine ever taught. He selected the third option. Standing exposed in the open with nothing but his carbine, Technical Sergeant Charles Coolidge demanded that the entire German company surrender to him immediately. The Germans did not comply with his demand. They raised their weapons to firing positions. One American sergeant confronting 150 enemy soldiers. The distance separating them measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Coolidge did not flee. He did not release his weapon and raise his hands. He brought his carbine to his shoulder, acquired sight picture on the nearest German soldiers, and fired first. He wounded 2 enemy soldiers before the entire company unleashed concentrated fire on his position. The 4 longest days of his existence had just commenced. The bullets snapped through the air around Coolidge before he had completed his trigger press. German rifles, machine pistols, and at least one MG-42 machine gun opened fire simultaneously. The forest exploded into chaos. Coolidge and the Company K sergeant sprinted back toward their position. Rounds cracked through branches overhead. Bark exploded from tree trunks as bullets struck wood. The Germans were pursuing aggressively, pressing their numerical advantage, attempting to overrun the American position before the defenders could organize coherent resistance. Coolidge reached his men within seconds. What he encountered nearly paralyzed him. The replacements had heard the gunfire erupting from the forest. They understood that contact with the enemy had been established. Several had frozen in place, bodies rigid with the neurological shock of their first exposure to combat. Others were glancing at each other, waiting for orders, waiting for someone with authority to tell them what actions to take. A few had started edging backward instinctively, their bodies responding to the primal urge to flee from the sound of weapons designed to kill human beings. They had trained for this moment. They had practiced fire and movement drills at stateside military installations. They had been lectured about what combat would feel like, what sounds they would hear, what fear would taste like in their mouths. Nothing in their training had prepared any man for the reality of bullets passing close enough to hear their passage through air. Coolidge had no time for explanations or encouragement. The Germans were advancing through the forest. He could hear them moving, hear their shouted commands, hear them organizing their assault. Perhaps 90 seconds until they struck the American position. Perhaps less. He started walking. Not running. Not crawling. Walking. Coolidge moved along the line of his men, speaking calmly, pointing to specific positions, adjusting fields of fire with precise hand gestures. He inspected each machine gun emplacement. He positioned riflemen to provide security for the guns. He ensured every man understood his assigned sector of responsibility. The German fire intensified dramatically. Rounds slammed into trees above the American position. The MG-42 ripped bursts that sounded like canvas being torn by invisible hands. Mortar shells began falling somewhere to the left flank. Coolidge continued walking. The heavy machine guns represented his only tactical advantage. The water-cooled Brownings could maintain continuous fire for extended periods without overheating failures. The German MG-42 fired faster, achieved higher cyclic rates, but required barrel changes every few hundred rounds to prevent catastrophic malfunction. In a sustained engagement, American heavy guns could maintain volume of fire sufficient to shatter an infantry assault. If the crews remained on their weapons. If they did not panic. If they fired where he directed them to fire. The first German assault materialized through the trees like a gray wave of violence. Infantry advancing in short rushes, covering each other's movement, using forest terrain for concealment. Professional soldiers. Men who had been fighting since Poland in 1939. Men who understood exactly how to eliminate a hilltop defended by inexperienced American troops. Coolidge shouted fire commands. The Brownings erupted. The effect was immediate and devastating. German soldiers dropped. Others dove for cover behind trees and fallen logs. The assault stalled 20 yards short of the American defensive perimeter. For a brief moment, the firing decreased in intensity as the Germans withdrew to reassess their approach. They had anticipated frightened replacements. They had expected easy prey, young Americans who would break under the first serious pressure. They had not expected concentrated machine gun fire directed with precision timing by someone who understood the geometry of defensive combat. The Germans launched their second assault within 15 minutes. Different approach vector, different angle of attack, identical result. The Brownings cut them apart before they could close with the American line. By midday on October 24, the German company had mounted 4 separate assaults against Hill 623. Each attack had been repelled with mounting German casualties. The forest floor in front of the American position was littered with enemy dead and wounded, but Coolidge understood the mathematics with brutal clarity. The Germans had deployed roughly 150 soldiers. They had lost perhaps 20 men in the morning attacks, a significant number, but not crippling. They still outnumbered his force by more than 10 to 1. They would not stop. They would probe systematically for weakness. They would bring up reinforcements from rear areas. They would find a method to flank his position or simply overwhelm it through sheer weight of numbers. His ammunition was finite. His men were exhausted from adrenaline crash and accumulated stress. Several replacements had performed beyond any reasonable expectations once the firing commenced, discovering reserves of courage they had not known they possessed. But the psychological strain of sustained combat was cumulative and unforgiving. Men who fought bravely in the morning might break psychologically by evening as fear and exhaustion compounded. The rain continued falling without mercy. Temperatures dropped steadily toward freezing. The Vosges forest transformed into a nightmare landscape of mud, fog, and sporadic gunfire that cracked through the trees at irregular intervals. Coolidge had held through the first day. His inexperienced troops had survived their baptism of fire without sustaining a single American casualty. But the Germans remained out there in the forest, regrouping, analyzing their tactical failures, planning their next assault, waiting for darkness to mask their movements. Night descended on Hill 623. Somewhere in the forest beyond visual range, German commanders were studying their maps, counting their losses, calculating probabilities, and preparing something larger and more coordinated. Coolidge posted sentries at key positions, checked his ammunition supply with growing concern, and waited. Dawn was 8 hours distant. The Germans had all night to prepare their next attempt. The night of October 24 passed in frozen silence, periodically shattered by gunfire. German patrols probed the American perimeter twice before midnight. Each time, Coolidge directed brief bursts from the Brownings that drove them back into the darkness without revealing his complete defensive layout. No one slept. The temperature plummeted below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Rain transformed to sleet, then reverted to rain. The men in their foxholes had no opportunity to build fires for warmth, no chance to dry their uniforms, no relief from the cold that seeped through wool and cotton until it reached bone and remained there. Coolidge moved between positions throughout the night, checking ammunition counts with increasing worry, ensuring sentries remained alert despite exhaustion, speaking quietly to men who were experiencing their first combat and discovering that war was mostly waiting. Waiting in the cold. Waiting in the dark. Waiting for something terrible to happen. Dawn on October 25 brought fog so dense the tree line disappeared at 30 yards. The Germans exploited it immediately. The first attack came without warning signs. No preparatory fire to soften the position. No visible movement to telegraph their intentions. Just gray shapes materializing from gray mist, already within grenade range when the American sentry spotted them and shouted warning. Coolidge reacted instantaneously. He had positioned his guns precisely for this scenario. Overlapping fields of fire that created a kill zone regardless of visibility conditions. The Brownings erupted. Tracers vanished into the fog. German soldiers fell. The attack disintegrated in less than 2 minutes. But the Germans had gained valuable intelligence. They had tested American response time. They had identified gun positions by muzzle flash. They were gathering information for future assaults. The second attack of October 25 came from a completely different direction. The Germans had maneuvered through the night, circling east, searching for a gap in Coolidge's perimeter. They found the seam between two machine gun positions and poured through it like water finding a crack. Fighting reached hand-to-hand distances. American riflemen fired at shapes appearing from the fog. Germans threw stick grenades that detonated among the trees with sharp cracks. For 90 seconds, Hill 623 became a chaos of close combat where friend and enemy were distinguished only by the sound of their weapons and the desperate prayers men whispered while killing. Coolidge grabbed his carbine and sprinted toward the breach. He found 3 German soldiers inside the American perimeter, working their way toward a machine gun position from behind, intending to kill the crew and capture the weapon. He killed one, wounded another with rapid fire. The third retreated into the fog. The gap was sealed. The attack was repulsed, but the cost was visible and mounting. 2 of his men had been wounded. Not seriously enough to require immediate evacuation, but enough to reduce their combat effectiveness. His already small force was shrinking. The afternoon brought 3 more assaults, each smaller than the morning attacks, each testing different sections of the perimeter. The Germans were probing systematically, searching for the weakness that would allow them to collapse the entire position in a single decisive push. They did not find it. By nightfall on October 25, Coolidge had been in continuous contact with the enemy for 36 hours. His men had repelled at least 8 separate attacks. Ammunition was running dangerously low. His 2 wounded soldiers needed evacuation that could not occur while German forces surrounded the hill. The mathematics remained brutal and unforgiving. The German company had taken significant casualties over 2 days, perhaps 30 or 40 dead and wounded. But reinforcements were reaching them. Coolidge could hear vehicles moving somewhere beyond the forest. Engines. Voices. The sounds of an enemy growing stronger while his own force grew weaker. That night, American artillery fired harassment rounds into the German rear areas. The shells passed overhead with a sound like freight trains, detonating somewhere beyond the treeline. Each explosion briefly illuminated the fog with orange light. Coolidge used the illumination to check his positions one more time. His men were holding, exhausted, frozen, running low on everything except determination, but holding. He had no communication with battalion headquarters. His radio had failed on the first day of combat. No one behind the lines knew whether his force was still fighting or had been overrun and destroyed. No relief column was being organized because no one could authorize relief to a position that might no longer exist. October 26 would be day 3. Coolidge counted his remaining ammunition, calculated how many more attacks he could repel, and arrived at a number that was not encouraging. Somewhere in the darkness, German commanders were reaching the same conclusion. 3 days of infantry assaults had failed to dislodge the Americans. The position on Hill 623 would not break through persistence alone. They needed something heavier. October 26 began with mortar fire. The Germans had adjusted their tactical approach. Instead of infantry rushing through the fog, shells began falling on the American position at first light. The explosions walked across Hill 623 in a methodical pattern. Air burst rounds detonated in the tree canopy, showering fragments downward into foxholes. Coolidge ordered his men deeper into their fighting positions. The mortars were designed to break them psychologically before the next infantry assault. Keep them pinned. Keep them afraid. Soften them for the killing blow. The barrage continued for 20 minutes. When it stopped, the silence felt almost painful against their ringing ears. Then the Germans came again. This assault was different, larger, better coordinated, more professional. The enemy company had received reinforcements overnight. Fresh troops who had not spent 2 days bleeding against American machine guns. They advanced in proper formation, using fire and movement tactics, suppressing each position before pushing forward. Coolidge watched them come with the detachment of a man who had accepted death as probable. He had perhaps 40 rounds remaining for his carbine. The Brownings had enough ammunition for maybe 2 more sustained engagements. After that, his men would be fighting with rifles, pistols, and whatever they could scavenge from the enemy dead. The machine guns opened fire. Germans dropped, but more kept coming, stepping over their fallen comrades. The volume of return fire was heavier than anything the previous 2 days had produced. Bullets struck the logs protecting the gun positions. Bark and splinters filled the air. One of the Brownings jammed. The assistant gunner worked frantically to clear the malfunction. A belt had twisted during feeding. A simple problem with a simple solution under normal circumstances, but under fire, simple problems became life-threatening emergencies. Coolidge sprinted to the position, grabbed the weapon, and cleared the jam in seconds. He had performed this action hundreds of times in training and combat. His hands knew the movement without conscious thought. The gun resumed firing. The German assault faltered again, but the pattern was unmistakable. Each attack pushed closer to the American line. Each attack lasted longer before breaking. Each attack left more German bodies on the ground but also depleted more American ammunition. By midday, Coolidge conducted an honest assessment of his tactical situation. His force had suffered 4 wounded over 3 days. All remained on the line, fighting through their injuries because there was no alternative. His ammunition supply would sustain perhaps 2 more major engagements. His men had been awake for over 60 hours with only brief intervals of unconsciousness that could not be called rest. The Germans had lost far more, perhaps 50 or 60 casualties over 3 days of continuous assault. But they were being resupplied. They were rotating fresh troops into the line. They had the weight of numbers that could absorb losses and continue attacking. Coolidge had 12 men on a hilltop with no relief in sight. The afternoon of October 26 brought something unexpected. The German attack stopped completely. The forest fell quiet. No probing patrols. No harassing fire. Nothing. Coolidge recognized the silence. He had seen it before in Italy. The Germans paused their assault when they were preparing something decisive. When they were bringing up assets that would fundamentally change the nature of the fight. He sent 2 men forward as scouts. They returned within the hour with information that confirmed his fears. Vehicles were moving in the German rear, not trucks, something heavier. The scouts had heard the distinctive sound of tracked vehicles grinding through the forest, the metallic clank of tank treads on frozen ground. The Germans were bringing armor. Infantry alone had failed to break Hill 623. Machine guns alone had failed to dislodge the American defenders. But tanks changed everything. A single armored vehicle could absorb machine gun fire indefinitely while its main gun systematically destroyed each American position. 2 tanks would make the work faster and more efficient. Coolidge had no anti-tank weapons except a single bazooka. The M1 rocket launcher was theoretically capable of penetrating German armor at close range. Theoretically. In practice, the bazooka was unreliable. Rockets failed to detonate. Launchers misfired. Even successful hits often failed to stop a tank completely. Night fell on October 26, somewhere beyond the tree line, tank engines idled in the darkness. German infantry rested, knowing that tomorrow they would advance behind steel instead of dying in front of American machine guns. Coolidge checked the bazooka, 1 launcher, 3 rockets, and a decision that would determine whether his men lived or died when dawn arrived. Dawn on October 27, 1944. The 4th day. Coolidge had not slept in over 70 hours. His men had managed brief intervals of unconsciousness in their foxholes, but true rest was impossible. The cold prevented it. The fear prevented it. The knowledge that German tanks were somewhere in the forest prevented it. The morning fog was thinner than previous days. Visibility extended to 50 yards, then 60. Coolidge could see the tree line where German infantry had launched their assaults. He could see the bodies that still lay in the undergrowth. He could see the approach route that tanks would use. The sound reached him before the sight. Metal grinding against earth. Engines straining. The unmistakable noise of armored vehicles moving through dense forest. Not one engine. 2. German infantry appeared first. They advanced slowly, staying behind the tree line, waiting for the armor to clear a path. These soldiers moved differently than the assault troops of previous days. They were patient, confident. They knew what was coming behind them. Then the tanks emerged from the fog. 2 German armored vehicles pushed through the forest toward Hill 623. Their main guns traversed slowly, searching for targets. Machine guns mounted in the hulls and turrets added to their firepower. Each tank carried enough ammunition to sustain hours of continuous combat. Coolidge watched them approach with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of extreme crisis. His Brownings were useless against armor. The water-cooled machine guns that had shattered every infantry assault for 3 days could fire at those tanks until their barrels melted and accomplished nothing. The rounds would bounce off the steel plate like rain off a roof. The bazooka was his only option. The M1 rocket launcher required close range to be effective. 50 yards was optimistic. 25 yards was realistic. To have any chance of stopping a tank, Coolidge would need to leave his protected position and advance into the open toward the enemy while German infantry provided covering fire. He checked the launcher one more time. The electrical firing mechanism appeared functional. The 3 rockets were loaded and ready. Everything that could be inspected had been inspected. The tanks continued forward. Behind them, German infantry began spreading into assault formation. This was the coordinated attack that 3 days of fighting had been building toward. Armor and infantry working together, each element covering the weakness of the other. Coolidge's machine gunners looked at him. They had held this position through everything the Germans had thrown at them. They had repelled assault after assault. They had performed beyond any reasonable expectation for replacements experiencing their first combat. Now they were facing tanks with nothing but a single unreliable rocket launcher and a sergeant from Tennessee. The German formation closed to 100 yards. 80 yards. 70. The tanks moved deliberately, their commanders confident that the American position would collapse under the combined weight of armor and infantry. At 60 yards, the lead tank stopped. The turret hatch opened. A German officer stood up in the cupola, clearly visible, clearly unafraid. He called out to the American position. The German commander demanded surrender. He spoke in fluent English, making certain the Americans understood the situation. Tanks. Infantry. Overwhelming force. Continued resistance was pointless. Surrender now and they would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Coolidge stood up from his position. His men watched as their sergeant, the man who had kept them alive for 4 days against impossible odds, responded to the German demand. He refused. His words were brief, defiant, and carried clearly across the distance between the two forces. The German commander stared for a moment. Then he dropped back into his turret and closed the hatch. The tank lurched forward. The infantry began their advance. Coolidge grabbed the bazooka. He checked the rocket one final time. Then he climbed out of his foxhole and started walking toward the tanks. Not running. Walking. The same steady pace he had used for 4 days while enemy fire cracked around him. The same calm movement that had kept his men from panicking when panic would have been the natural response. 25 yards. That was the range he needed. 25 yards from a German tank that was also moving toward him. The distance closed with every step. German machine gun fire erupted the moment Coolidge left his foxhole. Bullets tore through the air around him. Tracers flickered past like angry insects. The infantry behind the tanks had spotted the American sergeant advancing with a rocket launcher and understood exactly what he intended. Coolidge kept walking. 40 yards from the lead tank. 35. 30. The bazooka was heavy across his shoulder. The rocket inside it was his only chance to stop the armor that would otherwise roll over his position and kill every man under his command. 25 yards. Coolidge dropped to one knee, brought the launcher to his shoulder, aimed at the front glassy plate of the lead tank, and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The electrical ignition system had failed. The rocket sat inert in the tube. The firing mechanism that was supposed to send a shaped charge into German armor produced only a hollow click. Coolidge pulled the trigger again. Another click. The weapon was dead. He threw the bazooka aside. For a moment, he was kneeling in the open, 25 yards from a German tank with no weapon capable of stopping it. Machine gun fire continued snapping past him. The tank's main gun was traversing toward his position. German infantry was advancing behind the armor. Most men would have run. Most men would have sprinted back toward their foxholes, hoping to reach cover before the tank's gunner found the range. Most men would have accepted that the situation was hopeless and tried to survive. Coolidge did not run. He gathered every hand grenade he could carry. Fragmentation grenades from his own equipment. Grenades taken from wounded men over the past 4 days. Grenades scavenged from German bodies after repelled assaults. His pockets bulged with explosives. Then he started crawling forward. The tank's machine gun opened fire. Rounds chewed into the ground around him. Dirt sprayed into his face. He kept crawling. The German infantry was closer now, advancing in short rushes, trying to reach positions where they could shoot down at the American sergeant who refused to retreat. Coolidge began throwing grenades. Not at the tank, grenades would not stop armor. He threw them at the infantry, at the German soldiers who were trying to close with his position, at the men who would overrun his machine gun crews if he did not stop them here. The explosions ripped through the German advance. Soldiers dropped. Others dove for cover. The coordinated assault that had begun with such confidence began fragmenting as grenades detonated among the infantry formations. Coolidge threw grenade after grenade. He crawled forward between throws, closing distance, making each explosion more accurate. The Germans had expected the American position to collapse when the tanks appeared. They had not expected a single sergeant to attack them. Behind Coolidge, his machine gunners poured fire into the German infantry. The Brownings had been ineffective against armor but remained devastating against exposed soldiers. The combination of grenades from the front and machine gun fire from the hilltop created chaos in the German ranks. The infantry assault stalled. German soldiers went to ground, unwilling to advance into the storm of fragmentation and automatic weapons fire. The tanks continued forward, but tanks without infantry support were vulnerable. Isolated armor could be flanked, could be swarmed, could be destroyed by determined soldiers with improvised weapons. The German commanders recognized the problem. Their infantry was pinned. Their coordinated attack had disintegrated. The American sergeant who should have been killed in the first seconds of his suicidal advance was still throwing grenades, still inflicting casualties, still refusing to die. But mathematics had not changed. Coolidge ran out of grenades. His machine gunners ran out of ammunition. The tanks were still operational, still advancing, and now his men had nothing left to stop them. For days of fighting had depleted every resource. Courage alone could not substitute for bullets and rockets. Coolidge made the decision that commanders dread. He ordered withdrawal. Not a retreat. Not a rout. An organized movement to the rear. Each element covering the others, maintaining discipline even as they abandoned the position they had held for 4 days. The last man to leave Hill 623 was Technical Sergeant Charles Coolidge. The withdrawal from Hill 623 was executed with precision that defied the circumstances. Coolidge positioned himself at the rear of the column, carbine ready, watching for German pursuit as his men moved through the forest toward American lines. The pursuit never materialized. The German force that had spent 4 days attempting to capture a single hilltop was too damaged to follow. Their infantry had suffered catastrophic casualties. The coordinated assault with tank support had collapsed into confusion. By the time German commanders reorganized their forces, the Americans had vanished into the Vosges fog. Coolidge led his men back to battalion headquarters. 12 soldiers had held Hill 623 for 96 hours against a reinforced German company supported by armor. They had repelled more than a dozen separate assaults. They had inflicted an estimated 50 to 60 enemy casualties. Not a single American had been killed. The wounded who had been hit during the 4-day engagement all survived. They had continued fighting through their injuries, manning positions, following orders, trusting the sergeant who had kept them alive when every tactical calculation said they should have been overrun. Battalion command was stunned. The position on Hill 623 had been considered lost after the first day. When radio contact failed, headquarters assumed the small force had been destroyed or captured. Relief operations had been considered but rejected as too costly given the German strength in the sector. The 12 men on that hilltop had been ridden off. Now they walked back into American lines, exhausted, frozen, out of ammunition, but alive. Every single one of them. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the 36th Division. Officers who had fought across Italy and France recognized the significance. Holding a position for 4 days against overwhelming odds was extraordinary. Holding it without losing a single man was almost unprecedented. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was initiated within days. Military bureaucracy moved slowly, even for exceptional cases. Documentation had to be gathered. Witness statements had to be collected. The chain of command had to review and approve each level of the nomination. Months would pass before the final decision reached Washington. Coolidge remained on the front lines throughout the process. Regulations specified that Medal of Honor nominees should be removed from combat. The military did not want to risk losing a potential recipient before the award could be presented. But no one told Coolidge about this regulation, and no one in his chain of command enforced it. He continued fighting through the winter of 1944 and into 1945. The 36th Division pushed through the Vosges, crossed into Germany, and drove toward the heart of the collapsing Reich. Coolidge was present for all of it. He had been offered a battlefield commission after his actions in Italy, a promotion to lieutenant that would have recognized his leadership abilities and given him formal authority over the men he already commanded informally. He had refused. He had entered the army as an enlisted man and intended to leave the same way. The Medal of Honor presentation occurred on June 18, 1945, at a bombed-out airfield near Dornstadt, Germany. Lieutenant General Wade Haislip performed the ceremony. The war in Europe had ended 5 weeks earlier. Coolidge was 23 years old. The citation documented what had happened on Hill 623. 4 days of continuous fighting. Leadership of inexperienced troops under fire. The advance against German tanks with a malfunctioning bazooka. The grenade assault that broke the final enemy attack. The orderly withdrawal that preserved his entire force. The medal itself was a 5-pointed bronze star hanging from a light blue ribbon. The same design awarded to soldiers since the Civil War for actions above and beyond the call of duty. Coolidge wore it for the official photographs, then packed it away. He did not consider himself a hero. He had done what the situation required. His men had needed leadership. He had provided it. The outcome could have been different. The bazooka could have fired. The Germans could have pressed their final assault. He could have died on that hilltop like thousands of other sergeants died across Europe. The war was over. Charles Coolidge wanted to go home to Tennessee. But the Medal of Honor would follow him for the rest of his life, shaping the next 76 years in ways he never anticipated. Charles Coolidge returned to Signal Mountain, Tennessee, in the autumn of 1945. He went back to work at Chattanooga Printing and Engraving, the family business where he had learned bookbinding as a teenager. He married. He raised a family. He lived quietly in the same community where he had grown up. The Medal of Honor recipient became a printer. Coolidge rarely spoke about the war. When asked about Hill 623, he deflected attention from himself to the men who had served with him. 12 soldiers had held that position. 12 soldiers had fought for 4 days without rest. The medal around his neck represented their collective effort, not his individual heroism. Decades passed. The 36th Division veterans held reunions that grew smaller each year as age claimed the men who had survived Salerno, Anzio, and the Vogue. Coolidge attended when he could. He shook hands with soldiers who remembered the sergeant who had walked through German fire like it could not touch him. Recognition accumulated slowly. In 1989, a 9-mile section of U.S. Route 27 in Hamilton County, Tennessee, was renamed the Charles H. Coolidge Medal of Honor Highway. In 1999, the city of Chattanooga opened Coolidge Park on the north shore of the Tennessee River. 13 acres of public space featuring a restored carousel, walking paths, and river overlooks. A park named for a man who had never sought fame and never understood why strangers wanted to shake his hand. France remembered what Coolidge had done in the Vogue. In 2006, 62 years after the battle for Hill 623, the French government awarded him the Legion of Honor, their highest military decoration presented to an 85-year-old veteran who had helped liberate their country when he was barely old enough to vote. The Charles H. Coolidge Medal of Honor Heritage Center opened in downtown Chattanooga in February 2020. A museum dedicated to preserving the stories of Medal of Honor recipients and educating visitors about the meaning of service above self. Coolidge attended the opening ceremony. He was 98 years old. By then, he was one of only 2 living Medal of Honor recipients from World War II. The generation that had fought across Europe and the Pacific was disappearing. Men who had stormed beaches and held hilltops and endured horrors that defined the 20th century were dying at a rate of several hundred per day. Each death took memories that could never be recovered. Each funeral closed a chapter of history. Charles Coolidge died on April 6, 2021. He was 99 years old. His death left only one living World War II Medal of Honor recipient, the last connection to a conflict that had shaped the modern world, the final witness to an era when ordinary men performed extraordinary acts because the situation demanded it and no one else would. Coolidge had lived 76 years after Hill 623. He had watched the world transform from the devastation of global war to the complexity of the 21st century. He had seen his country fight in